Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on our webinar to look at sort of how to go about talking about your electrification journey as a developer and some thoughts on not only the subject matter and how we approach that, but a little bit of the market and really some thoughts on how you might move towards building a strategy for your organization. Clearly a great week to talk about strategy when it comes to decarbonisation, an economic opportunity with events in Cornwall. I would, without getting political, venture to suggest that flying from London to Cornwall probably wasn't the greatest headline sustainable mobility point today. So hopefully we're here to probably show a better way and an alternative way and have a think about, you know, really how we marry up the drive towards decarbonisation with economic opportunity and in doing so create something that is attractive for businesses, attractive for end users and tenants and customers, and also for our local community. So it is possible to have it every way. I don't go with the view that net zero and sustainability all comes at cost. It comes with an awful lot of opportunity and an awful lot of benefit to make something that is in fact really cool. So with that in mind, let's move on and introduce very quickly myself and the team. My name is Chris. I'm head of the mobility team for Dancy. I'm an NG partner, so I bring that sort of energy development world through to looking at electrification and zero emission transport. With me is Mark, Christian, Becca, and we're very, very pleased to be joined by Simon Cordery from GridServe, who an organisation I'm sure many of you will have heard of, and they're not often out of the news, but they're particularly in the news this week for having acquired the Electric Highway, which is Ecotricity's motorway or very sort of trailblazing motorway service charging network, which I think has been with us probably a decade or so. So very grateful to have you here, Simon, and he'll be sort of sharing his thoughts from an industry perspective in a little while. So in the meantime, we are just to give you an idea of the agenda, we're going to let Mark just sort of introduce the concept of mobility, which is clearly broader than just electric cars. And that's something we'll come back to more than once. And Christian is our sort of head of infrastructure planning. We'll be sort of then just having a few thoughts on how, certainly to date, a lot of this has been driven by the planning regime, and it's been quite responsive, and it's been a lot about a sort of reactive approach to what your sort of local planning authority are telling you. I'm going to then come back on screen and talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing with other organisations about looking how you approach this, and the word is holistically, and not piecemeal and not responsive, and really trying to work out what as an organisation this really means to you and what we can do about it. My colleague Becca then will come in and just have a think about the procurement process and some of the key considerations that we have to bear in mind when we're looking at our contracts with our partners, sort of very much from the coal face, top 10 things to think about. It could be a different 10 things tomorrow, but today these are the top 10 things for us. And then, as I mentioned, then we'll come on to Simon and hear his thoughts from a GridServe perspective, which we're very much looking forward to. So thanks very much for that. I will drop off screen and hand over, I think, now to Mark, who's going to take up the baton and talk to us a little bit about the world of mobility. Thanks, Mark. But he's got to learn to use the mute button first.
Apologies for that. Sorry, two screens and sharing screens with two arrows. So morning, everyone. So my name's Mark Lee. I'm a legal director and part of our mobility team, which, as Chris described, is a multidisciplinary team which comprises the whole discipline of lawyers. So commercial, corporate, data, energy, planning, and property lawyers, of which I'm one. The focus is clearly on electric vehicles and mobility, and it will be of no surprise this is an area that's constantly evolving. And we'd like to think that we are very much helping to drive the conversations and the new behaviours and the adoption of more sustainable methods of transport. So on the slide you see in front of you there are some of the organisations we're involved with. And it won't surprise you to hear that over the last couple of years, there's been quite a significant increase in the activity in this space. So some recent examples of our engagement with the market are as follows. You've got the Urban Mobility Partnership, or as I coin them, UMP. This is a coalition committed to providing leadership and tangible near-term solutions to improve future urban mobility. The group was founded to ensure that there's effective policy in place at a national, regional and local level, which combined with new technology supports better mobility and helps tackle the major challenges that we face of congestion, air quality and climate change. Other members of the coalition include Stagecoach, Brompton, Enterprise and Bosch, and we're very much sort of the legal arm of all of this. And to date, the activities of the group have focused on the release of policy papers and reports, including a planning paper that Christian has recently drawn together, and promoting political engagement with key stakeholders at Westminster and at local and regional government level. So, for example, we recently, as a group, hosted some of the mayoral hustings for the WECA mayoral elections. In addition to that, we've been involved with the West Midlands Connect project. That's a collaboration with WSP, where we're jointly instructed by the transport arm of the Midlands Engine, which at the Midlands Connect, to provide guidance in relation to site selection for rural mobility hubs that would include electric vehicle infrastructure across the region. Our input on this was in respect to providing legal advice as to the operational and commercial aspects that need to be considered, and the sort of the commercial structures that would need to be put in place for operating mobility hubs. And our report has helped inform Midland Connect strategy going forwards to create a network of mobility hubs in a rural setting across its region. The final project that will be of interest that we've been involved with is Deletty. So we've been providing legal services to Devon County Council for their EV charging infrastructure and services procurement programme. I'll have to definitely read this because it's quite a mouthful. It's called the Devon Low Carbon Energy and Transport Technology Innovator, hence Deletty. The programmes will prevent more than 300 tonnes of carbon from entering the atmosphere every year. It's a £1.3 million project to install electric vehicle charge points for public use across Devon's car park portfolio. So we've been advising the council on site selection, concession agreements, leases, power purchase agreements, and then mobility related data strategy. Interestingly, following on from our work on this, we're also now engaged on a very, very similar project for Plymouth City Council. So that's some of the work that we've been involved with, and my colleagues in a moment will discuss more specifically the issues that you should consider in relation to electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. But I thought it would be of interest just to summarise the benefits of electrification and the integration of new development schemes into a mobility ecosystem, particularly given my background in property development. So firstly, I think it's important to have in your mind that when we're talking about mobility as a concept, that not only are we talking about the movement of people, but also the movement of goods and services to where communities need them. So Chris has very helpfully moved the slide on. So you would have heard that I've mentioned mobility hubs previously. And you'll see on the image on the slide what I would describe as an exemplar version of a multimodal mobility hub that could serve a development. I would describe a mobility hub as a location where different transport modes are co-located and feed into a network of hubs or modes of transport. So ultimately, a mobility hub could be as simple as a bus stop with some bike provision. So nothing too exciting there. But the image that you'll see on the slide there is very much an aspiration. So you'll see that the hub that's shown is very much a hive of activity, and the tangible benefits that this could bring to a development scheme are numerous. So firstly, it provides multiple modes of transport, be it by, in this example, car, bus or bike, that is fully integrated to give consumers flexibility and choice that will be attractive to occupiers and truly make a development connected. In some instances, as I said, your hub could be just simply a bus stop with some bikes or e-scooters, or actually it could be a major transport interchange, such as a rail station or a park and ride. But the important thing that underpins all of this is about convenience and giving people a smoother commute from their front door to their destination that may involve more than one mode of transport. In addition to giving consumers this choice, a hub will promote the adoption of other modes of transport that will that are greener and help shift consumers away from private car ownership, and ultimately help drive the transition to net zero travel. So rather than the only choice being your own car, individuals will be able to connect into public and shared travel modes, or have access to active travel solutions such as bikes, scooters, and so on. So in addition to addressing government policy and the drive to net zero, there are also important commercial benefits as well that these hubs could bring. One of these is about future-proofing schemes and making them as attractive as possible to occupiers. So the provision of EV infrastructure and mobility hubs meets the consumer demand for all of us to move around in a much more sustainable fashion. But it also actually deals with a predicted drop-off in demand for younger generations to aspire to car ownership. So whether that's be for ethical or economic reasons, actually car ownership is not something that people aspire to anymore. By providing this infrastructure, you're going some way to future-proofing your developments to meet these challenges and demands. So the example that I always think of is sort of your Apple charger, and thinking about making sure that you've got that flexibility, so that I think when Apple brought out their new Lightning charger overnight, all the old chargers were non-existent, and so USBs had to be reconfigured. So it's about making sure that you have that flexibility in your schemes and you design the effective capacity you need to flex. One other important thing to mention is that the aspiration is that this physical connectivity is underpinned by technology that will further integrate the various modes of transport on a single platform, so that consumers can plan journeys, they can have integrated ticketing or subscription services, and the potential for an on-demand service, which is very much coming down the pipeline. Obviously, there are data issues in relation to that, and the data will have some value, which I won't go down into the rabbit hole of discussing because it's not my area of expertise. But actually, there is one other useful bit on the data on that, in that the data on such platforms will be helpful for operators and local authorities to actually manage traffic and to ensure that the right provision is being given to the right areas at the right times. So, as I've said before, a mobility hub isn't just about transporting people. I think we've started to coin the phrase ourselves internally here, is that rather than them being simply mobility hubs, they're also accessibility hubs, because it's about giving access to goods and services, not just about moving people. So if you look at this mobility hub, for example, it can be a community centre to provide additional services and help with placemaking in a scheme. So in the image, you can see, for example, that there's recreational space, there's lockers for e-commerce deliveries, there's retail, and also an ice cream store. But mobility hubs could also host other services such as health centres or libraries. So you're getting the concepts of 15-minute cities, or as we're sort of starting to advocate, 30-minute rural sort of hubs in rural settings. It's about having everything on your doorstep. And if the pandemic's taught us anything, people are now looking to be more local. And these mobility hubs provide a location not just for that transport provision, but for also a hive of other activity. Additionally, what you can also create with these hubs is sort of a virtuous circle and nudge behavioral change. So, for example, being rewarded for using active modes of transport like a bike or a high bike or a scooter, by being rewarded with a discount from the coffee shop that's located on the hub. We're seeing much more of that sort of nudge behavioral sort of aspect being employed with this, and it does then increase the use of the hub. Finally, what hubs also do is encourages efficient use of space and assets. So ultimately, they'll reduce traffic, they'll free up space that would otherwise be taken up with car parks or garages, driveways, and then this space could be utilised for additional units or community assets or public realm that will ultimately enhance your schemes. So I hope that's been helpful in explaining some of the work we do and some of the benefits that mobility hubs and electrification can bring. And I'll now hand over to Christian, who will run you through the planning considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and hello, everyone. So we're moving on to the next slide now. So there are two key aspects here that I'm going to cover. One is an update on the National Planning Policy Framework and the Planning White Paper that was published last year, and key requirements and opportunities in the planning system. And I'm going to pick up that second point first. So the way the planning system works at the moment is that local authorities adopt local planning policies that address transport requirements. Those feed through to decision making on planning applications, and planning permissions will be granted subject to planning conditions, and there might be Section 106 obligations that set out requirements in relation to EV charging points and infrastructure, for example. So that's a very reactive process that I've just described there. Also, to bear in mind that some of that infrastructure might require highway consent. So standard one for infrastructure that might be placed on the currently adopted highway is a Section 50 highway license. Although worth bearing in mind that a number of local authorities are adopting their own policies in relation to whether or not longitudinal infrastructure should be permitted on highways. So you can't be guaranteed that you will get highway consent for some of that infrastructure. And it might also be that highway adoption considerations come into play in relation to placing your infrastructure under estate roads that you're intending to be adopted. Again, referring back to that highways policy that I mentioned, that a number of local authorities are not willing to adopt estate roads where there is going to be infrastructure below the highway because they're concerned that infrastructure providers are going to need to dig open the highway at a future date for maintenance purposes, and that will cause damage over the long term to highways. So a few practical points to consider in what is currently a very reactive planning and highway consenting process. Now, planning practice guidance and the National Planning Policy Framework have recently undergone consultation on revisions to make changes to adopt more economic, social, and environmental principles through those policies. Now, planning practice guidance is the document that guides local authorities as to how to implement the National Planning Policy Framework policies into their local land use policy documents and how they should also feed those through into their decision making. Now, the emphasis in the NPPF is very much still on sustainable transport. And despite the consultation in February this year on amendments to the NPPF, the emphasis still is very much around sustainable transport. There isn't a single mention of mobility in that document. And so where this creates an opportunity for developers is to look at bridging that gap between sustainable transport and mobility that helps deliver sustainable communities and social equity, which touches on some of the points that Mark was mentioning in his slides. So those more creative solutions could create a real benefit to developers in terms of the saleability of their residential units and can create value. We have anecdotal evidence from developer clients that many purchasers are prepared to place a premium on high levels of mobility. And that also feeds into the delivery of sustainable communities, which can only be a good thing. So what we have currently is the mandating of EV infrastructure to be provided, which is a very low level of requirement. That's quite a low threshold, but a real opportunity to developers to make a difference between what policy mandates and the opportunities that are available, such as those set out in Mark's slides. So moving on to the NPPF, as I mentioned, there was a consultation earlier this year in relation to revisions to it, and that very much pulls through much more of an emphasis in relation to economic, social, and environmental matters. Now, what there is overall is a more general emphasis on environmental considerations and sustainability considerations, and not just transport sustainability. And so that feeds through to developers' opportunity to introduce more innovative opportunities in their development sites that will generally have this overarching national policy support. And hopefully over time, that national policy support will feed through into more creative policy making by local authorities. But as we know, the current policy making system is quite a slow one. So we can't wait for policy to catch up with the net zero and decarbonisation agenda. So that's very much the opportunity for developers. In terms of the planning white paper that was published last year and set out a radical set of proposals for revisions to the planning system, and particularly importantly in relation to planning policy. And that proposed that the local plan making system should be quite radically revised, and that statutory time period should be introduced for the adoption of local plans by local authorities. At the moment, there is no statutory time frame in which they must be adopted. There's only a requirement that local authorities must work up local plans. So the current proposal is that local authorities should have to adopt local plans within 30 months of any new legislation coming out that requires these changes. And there's a possibility that there will be a planning bill later this year that starts to put some flesh on the bones of the proposals of the planning white paper. What is also proposed is that national design codes and local design codes will be introduced to support what will be a much more zoning approach to planning rather than the quite detailed and lengthy planning policy documents that currently exist. So what you will see is local plans that are much more literally plans that zone development. And then the design codes can ensure that development has a consistent feel at the national and local level and even at the neighbourhood level. Now, that might on the face of it sound a little bit restrictive in terms of the opportunity for developers to exercise their imagination and creativity in bringing forward mobility solutions, particularly around EV charging hubs, for example, and mobility hubs. But what we expect is that local policy will adapt to react also to the net zero agenda. And with local plans being subject to 30-month adoption periods, what we're also likely to see is local planning policy being able to adapt much more quickly to the changing face of the environmental agenda. So that's it for me in relation to the planning aspects. So if I pass on now to Chris, I believe.
Chris and Mark, thanks very much indeed. We sort of had there a bit about the whys of what is mobility, what can it do for you, what is the planning landscape looking like now, and what might it look like, and what it's very likely to look like as we sort of move towards a slightly more sort of nuanced and involved arena. And I think, you know, again, bearing in mind that this is not about a sort of stick with which the various authorities are going to try and beat you, but there are huge opportunities to deliver something that is not only sort of compliant with the local and national planning policy frameworks, but genuinely delivers value and genuinely delivers something that's attractive, you know, can add to margins in the right way, and can also start to build out long-term revenues. So very much sort of not just carrot here to talk, sorry, not just stick here to talk about carrot. And I think just what I wanted to pick up on was just a few thoughts about how sort of one embraces this fairly exciting, fast-moving, and potentially overwhelming transition. And really just a few thoughts from the coalface on how to go about sort of grappling with this as a whole. And I'm sure your organisations are already a fair way down this road anyway. But for the benefit of the tape, this is just a few thoughts on strategy and on electrification. And the key thing is, I think, is building that consistency. I mean, what we've heard anecdotally is that there are lots and lots of discrepancies between requirements and questions from planning authorities, planning officers, and I think even though you've got sort of quite a range of requirements. Coming back with something uniform, something, you know, a consistent approach is quite important. And very much now is the time, I think, to be getting engaged with the market and starting to build those conversations with people who may be able to help you on that journey, whichever strategy you adopt. And also starting just to look at your own customer base and also your own employee base, and starting to ask the question and say, look, actually, not only have we got to transition here to a lower carbon form of transport, but, you know, post-COVID, the world is different. Everything is completely on its head. Which way are we going to end up? And I think now, for a number of reasons, is the time to look at, you know, generally, if you can get a grip on what sort of homeowner ambition is going to look like when it comes to traveling, where they want to locate, where they want to work, how they want to move about, and the same with your own employees. I mean, this is the time to be asking those questions because, you know, we're in a new footing here, in a new landscape. And clearly acting on information is a far more effective way to make decisions. So very much here now, the key is, I think, to get an EV or an electrification or indeed a mobility strategy, which is holistic. There is a danger, I think, if you set about it in silos, that you end up doing too much and over providing and treating each thing as a separate procurement or a separate engagement. And I think, as a typical housing developer, you might say there is clearly a need, or there will be some demand for home charging on the existing housing stock. Typically, that might well be delivered by the homeowner individually, or you may be able to leverage a much better package and much better engagement by doing this at volume. You may even be able to make some revenue. You may be able to create some consistency and some you know, good customer care, good standards, and so that's important to bear in mind. Clearly, EV charging requirements for new developments is of critical importance, and I think, again, trying to keep an open mind there as to what the possibilities might be. And it may be that putting you know, one home charger on every unit is not necessarily the right thing to do, or the right way to go. How can we do that in a way that is you know, efficient, economic, desirable for your customers, pays heed to things like what we need to do on the grid, any new substation requirements, but really just thinking a little bit more outside the box, and not just the one box on every front door approach, because there are different ways to do it, and there are different ways in which you as a developer can get involved and make some money, potentially, you know, have a hand in operating a network, or simply you just might want to be delivering good value to your customers and your users. Also bear in mind that you've probably got your own fleet, you've probably got your own company cars, and so again, not treating this in a vacuum, not treating it as in a silo, because there's nothing to stop operational fleet and company cars using some form of community EV charging, which is also serving your homeowners, also serving your communities as well. So keeping that in mind, and then looking at your own corporate real estate, looking at your own office requirements, your own employees, and again coming back to what the sort of the data is telling you about the way in which your employees want to travel and what they may want to do with their vehicles. We're doing lots of work with fleets at the minute, for whom actually the way they charge their fleets is at home at the employees' houses. And then you've got to grapple with slightly more interesting problems, such as how do you pay someone who's charging a vehicle at home for business purposes? How do you reimburse them? And the answer is you can do something very tortuous and have an expenses claim system and pay some tax on that expenses, or there are many solutions now, or many solutions. There is one particularly good solution where a company can step in and actually pay a domestic energy supplier, and you just get one bill for all your employees at the end of the month, which is clearly quite a good idea. So there are lots of options to consider here that are you know, easier than you might think. But I think the key here is to keep it all holistic and keep it all viewed together, because that will deliver not too many overlaps. It'll deliver a much better value package, and you know, you may break that up into different delivery partners, but I think having a strategy that looks at everything as a whole is important. There's also, and then keeping that's sort of the inward facing thing. That's your homeowners, your fleet, your employees. There's no reason whatsoever, and Mark, you know, outlined a vision for this really, in that you couldn't make public facing charging available, or as part of some form of hub, you know, coffee offering, farm shop, You could also have a sort of a hub where you have e-bikes available, car club, car sharing, and also sort of public EV charging. Again, it's not an enormous leap to create something where people may really want to stop by your development or stop by your community, deliver some revenue into that. It could be, you know, they come through from the EV charging, they have a coffee and they pop into the show home while they wait. There's any number of ways in which you can sort of turn your community to outward facing and bring people into that site. So anyway, keeping in mind the commercial opportunity is an important part of it. And I think having done that, having built your roadmap, let's use the phrase roadmap because it goes quite well, then it's a case of really starting to continue that engagement with the market and say, look, actually, again, this isn't something we're going to come to you and say, we're going to buy 2 charge points, please. Please give us your best price. It's to say, look, this is our strategy over the next 3, 4, 5 years. You know, we're looking for people to be part of that journey with us. And, you know, hopefully Simon would agree, but that's the kind of conversation where operators can say, yes, well, we'd love to be part of that with you. We'd like to scale and grow with you. And as such, you're going to get a much more positive engagement with them. Clearly, you don't have to be restricted to one, and you may want to develop a tender process to create a pool. And you also may want to slice and dice, you know, to find out what people are best at. That's all fine. That can be driven by your strategy, and will, provided it's done in a coordinated way, will drive best value for you over a number of years. So I think the key thing is not to try and do too many things on an ad hoc or responsive basis. Try and get your strategy, pull together a pool of people to deliver what you need as part of that strategy, and then you'll always be driving best value over the course of that framework or whatever it happens to be. And I say at the bottom there, in exploring wider commercial opportunities, this is not just about EV charging for people who happen to have got a company car that's a Tesla or a Leaf or an Audi or something that they're taking home with them. This is about thinking more about the way people want to move about, and that can totally shape the way you develop your spaces. It can shape how you make money from people to do that. To do it, we've got to understand how people want to spend their lives and how they want to get about or even not get about. You know, there's been an awful lot of change in people's habits. And I think if we can get that right, you can then build something that is a great community, a great space, fosters a sense of energy and of belonging. And also as part of that can also deliver on these decarbonisation targets as well. So I think it's keeping a bit of an open mind, mapping the immediate need with the future need, and then building a pool of people to work with you to deliver that. So that's a few thoughts on the strategy as I see it. Let's going to hand over to Becca now, who is going to just talk a little bit about the kind of things that crop up, assuming you're negotiating a framework agreement with a charging operator or a product provider. A few things that you might want to keep in mind.
Hello everyone. So as Chris said, I'm going to take you through some of the sort of top 10 things we look at when we're going through sort of contracts for procuring EV infrastructure hardware. So the first thing on our list is specification. It's really important that you've got a clear specification of what you're looking for. As you'll probably be aware, the EV infrastructure hardware market is evolving really quickly, and we quite often see that sales literature doesn't always keep pace with what the technical documentation is saying. Your installation is likely to need to comply with various consents, for example, a grid connection offer, lease, or potentially planning. So it's really important that you know what you're expecting to see when it arrives. Specification can also help future-proof your installation to an extent, because the specification can say you want your chargers to do X, Y, and Z, not that you necessarily want X model to arrive. So that can help you for future. The second thing to think about is delivery terms. The supply contracts need to have really clear delivery dates, and potentially think about a regime for recovering some of the costs you incur if there is any delay. What you've got to think about is you're potentially lining up installers and other parties that all need to integrate. And so you need to be able to hold the seller to their commitments on timing so that you don't end up getting penalised under some of the other contracts. This is particularly important to think about when you're thinking about infrastructure that's coming in from overseas, because there's a much greater risk of delay. Really need to check the delivery terms carefully, check who's responsible for storage, who's responsible for delivery costs. Quite often what we see is people using Incoterms, which is can be used as sort of form of industry shorthand, which then sets out what the parties' responsibilities are and where the risk lies at various points. The third point I'm going to talk about is force majeure. Just by way of explanation, in case you're not familiar with this type of clause, a force majeure clause typically excuses one or both parties from performance of a contract in some way, following certain events which are said to be beyond the control of the parties, for example, a natural disaster, a war, and as you're more familiar with at the moment, a COVID-19 pandemic can also fall within a force majeure clause if drafted correctly. However, actually, it's sometimes reasonable to carve COVID-19 and pandemics out of force majeure clauses, as actually quite a lot of the time the circumstances are known, and really the sellers should be contracting on the basis of what they are actually able to deliver and not make unrealistic commitments. They then just rely on the force majeure clause to keep. The fourth point on our list, title. You're going to want to make sure that you own the equipment. And you want to make sure that this title passes to you as soon as possible. This is quite often linked to when you've made a substantial part of the payment. You need to bear this in mind. This sort of sits alongside risk. This usually sits with the delivering party, but really important to check carefully the equipment is insured during transit by the right party so that you don't get any unexpected loss. Point number 5. Product warranties. You'll need to ensure that you've got adequate and sufficient warranties for the products you're buying. So if, for example, there's an issue in the future, you can go to the manufacturer and say, I need this repaired or replaced, depending on the terms of the warranty. And that's something you need to make sure there's not any sort of unreasonable exclusions in the warranty. The other thing that we quite often see is potentially being an issue of warranties is the right parties need to be able to rely on those warranties, and it's not always the seller of the hardware who's providing the warranty. So you just need to make sure that it is enforceable against the ultimate manufacturer. And on that point, it's also just worth doing some sort of financial due diligence on the warranty provider, just to check that they're actually going to be able to stand behind those warranties if you do want to make a claim under them. The 6th point is service levels. This might not always be the case, but if the seller of the hardware is also going to be providing ongoing maintenance of the hardware, you need to make sure you've got a robust service level agreement. This can be incorporated within the sales contract, or it can be as a separate document. Key things to think about when looking at service levels are the response times when there is a fault, their ability to provide remote monitoring and diagnosis, and then the timescales in which you want the equipment to be fixed. And you need to make sure there's some sanctions in there in case the KPIs are breached. This might be as simple as service credits, or if it's a really severe breach, you might want to consider some form of termination. 7th thing to think about is data. Data is becoming, as people are increasingly realizing, it's more and more valuable when it comes to EVs. Manufacturers often attempt to get the ownership of the data produced by the equipment in order to monitor performance, but actually some try to go further and get the utilization data, which can in some cases include personal data of users. Obviously, from a GDPR compliance perspective, you need to consider this very carefully. You also might want to think about how you might want to own the data to be able to monetize it to support your wider business objectives. We'd always advise that you presume that you as the purchaser own this data, and then you can grant the access that the seller or manufacturer needs to fulfill its obligations to you. But as you would appreciate, this is not the position that the seller or manufacturer is necessarily looking to see. So expect some element of negotiation on that. The 8th point on our list is additional revenue streams. Just want to sort of be aware of, keep an eye out for any additional revenue stream opportunities, whether from the data or from marketing, just because the sellers will probably be looking to keep that for themselves, and actually that's something you will probably want. The 9th point on the list, installation terms. If the hardware supplier is also going to be the installer, it's not always the case, but quite often is, It's just important to check what warranties they offer for the installation rather than the products itself that we mentioned earlier. And the insurance cover that they have in case of any damage, for example, if they cause any damage to your site or to customer cars whilst they're carrying out the installation. The final point on our sort of top 10 list of things to think about are OCPP and ISO 15118. Taking OCPP first, not all EV charging stations can be used with software supplied by another provider. So it's really important to ensure that the contract contains a warranty that the charging station is compliant with the Open Charging Protocol and can be used with any network service provider. This will help future-proof your equipment if, for example, in future, you want to keep the EV infrastructure hardware, but you want to take software from another provider because it provides you with different services. And then ISO 15118, this is an international standard, and in sort of very broad summary, it sort of defines the communications protocol between the electric vehicle and the charge point. And this really makes the customer charging experience as smooth as possible. For example, it allows the EV to identify itself with the charge point and can even enable vehicle to grid charging. So these are just two things that we sort of key standards we would always expect to see. Obviously, there's more you can put in that's more specific, but these are just sort of the high level ones that we would always look for. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feel of the kind of key things you're looking for in those sort of contracts. And I will now pass back to Chris, who's going to introduce Simon.
Thank you, Berka, very much. And it's a really, really helpful walkthrough. And I think what we'll do now is we'll send an autonomous electric vehicle to try and pick Becca up from the forest where she's clearly got herself a bit lost. But no, that was really helpful. Some actual law there, which is great. Simon, really lovely to have you. We look forward to your thoughts. What I would like to say to people on the call is if you would like to pop any questions in the Q&A, hopefully we'll have sort of 10 minutes or so at the end of the session to pick up on a few of those, but there isn't a chat that's disabled, but the Q&A is live. It'd be lovely to hear your thoughts or feedback. And in the meantime, Simon, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And hopefully your slides are lined up. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, that's great.
Do
Simon,
give me a nod when you'd like me to move them.
Yes, thank you. Well, thanks for the invite, Chris. Nice to be part of such an interesting and timely forum discussion. I'm Simon Cordery. I'm Origination Partner, which is basically a glorified way of saying I help GridServe do more projects. I'm leading the charge with them with looking at opportunities to develop relationships with landowners and electrical vehicle infrastructure charging opportunities. And I say that, but then I tend to touch on everything else as well. GridServe's ethos really is to make it really, really easy to own and use an electrical vehicle. If you go to the next slide, please, Chris. Our ambition is to provide cutting-edge, sustainable energy solutions across solar PV generation, energy storage and distribution, and the supply of cost-effective, very fast charging to customers, whether they're private, fleet, or a combination of the two, in useful, well-located, easily accessible, and pleasant settings up and down the country. Next slide, please, Chris. Our three main areas are grid power, EV power, and remote power. I won't talk about remote power today. That's something that really relates to more the telecoms, construction, and other sectors. But effectively, GridServe's background is in developing large solar projects up and down the country. In the previous iteration, we did some projects such as the Science Museum Annex in Swindon and the Rolls-Royce factory in Filton in Bristol. And we developed, I think, about 300 to 400 megawatts of power, which we built, and then we had a portfolio that we sort of had in planning. The next stage really has been about providing power to individuals on a retail basis rather than just providing power into the grid. Next slide, please, Chris. That's great. This is our showcase. This is what we built last year in the middle of the pandemic. This is the Braintree Electric Forecourt, which is a public-facing, ultra-rapid charging location in Braintree in Essex. It has 36 charging posts, 24 of which are ultra-rapid. The raison d'etre of this venture was really to build the petrol filling station of the future. And the idea is one of making it such that people can come up, plug in, and get 300-400 miles of range in 20 to 30 minutes. All of our chargers are ABB. They are cutting edge, latest design and technology. They will charge most cars several hundred miles in 20 to 30 minutes. And some cars, such as the Audi e-tron, which can charge very, very quickly, you can get 300 miles in under half an hour. So this is effectively a public-facing service station for the electrical vehicle user. Next slide, please, Chris. And what we have there is a sort of full-service retail experience. We have the ability to charge. You can then buy some food and drink. We have a retail operation there that is led by WH Smith, which has Costa, Booths, the Lancashire food and drink, sort of spot supermarket operator, really. We have the post office in there, and we have a WH Smith concession. And effectively, we really are pushing this very hard. We're developing about 100 of these across the country. I'll tell you some of the other locations in a little bit. But the idea is you plug in, you don't have to stand there with your hand on the charger like you do at a petrol filling station. You can go in, buy some food, coffee, do some emails, take a break, and effectively have a very pleasant experience while you're charging. And then your car goes bing, or the screen on the wall goes bing and says car full, off you go. So, at the moment, public-facing infrastructure tends to be bolted onto the back of other things in a fairly clunky manner. It's getting better, but it's not great. If you show up at a petrol filling station, the chargers are at the other end of the forecourt because of the sort of separation distances for flammable liquids and electrical infrastructure. So you have to sort of take your life in your hands and your children's life in your hands if you're crossing a greasy forecourt to go and find something to buy, eat or drink. And then in most situations, unless you're at a motorway filling station, you can't sit down inside and do something. So you have to sit in your car, and many of those sort of are outside. So the idea for us is to make it easy for people. So what we have done is basically look at doing this across the country. We are building 100 of these. We also have smaller product models which are based upon electric hubs which sit within existing roadside service locations with some of the coffee operators, the drive-through operators, where someone has already created a sort of a place for you to do something useful and enjoy yourself, food, drink, emails, a comfort break, that sort of thing. And then we're doing also charging in the a destination basis where we're offering relationships to fleet operators to effectively electrify their infrastructure. We work very closely with the likes of Network Rail. We're working with Enterprise Rent-A-Car to encourage the use of electric vehicles. We're looking at co-locating car rental and car club facilities at our sites and following them to their depots to electrify many of these, particularly around London, to create all electric rental and car club locations. The other thing that we have, two important things we have a leasing company with our funding partner, Hitachi Capital. So if you're looking at the electrification of a fleet, we can finance that for you. So we can provide the infrastructure for charging, and we can also help you to access the vehicles across the range, whether those are passenger vehicles, goods vehicles, white vans, that sort of thing, all up and down. And then we can effectively develop relationships with you to be able to effectively roll out infrastructure that is public facing, that is near to your customers, your employees, and your developments, and also then provide further infrastructure that complements your sort of fleet activity. We announced yesterday that we have now bought the 100% interest in the Ecotricity electric highway, which was Dale Vince's brainchild about 10 years ago. We are now the proud owners and operators of 150 plus sites, mainly along the trunk road and motorway networks, and the odd IKEA or two around the country, and the odd airport or two around the country. We're really pushing hard on that. We're upgrading 20 sites at the moment. Those will provide anywhere up to a dozen ultra-rapid charging locations across the country. For example, at Romsey Services on the M27, there are a dozen ultra-rapids going in on each eastbound and westbound motorway service station. So we're really moving the needle on ease of use, ease of accessibility, and we're also very cost effective. We're amongst the cheapest in the market. We're about a third of the price that Ionity charge, and we have a very straightforward contactless mechanism. So all in all, we've got a lot of solutions up our sleeves for public facing and fleet and business oriented solutions. We are very happy to engage with people on almost any sort of starting point in the conversation to help them with the transition. Our view is to move the needle on climate change, make it really dead simple to transition your fleet, and then to support that fleet with the provision of charging. And you know, we'd love to sort of have conversations with you. We're not the only guys out there in this market, but I think we have a sort of soup to nuts approach that people find really useful, because they can ask us to really sort of just take over and develop a strategy and implement that with them, and then to provide appropriate structure and funding and infrastructure to make it easy. Right, I'll stop there. I'm not allowed. I'll try and, I should say, other suppliers are available, but you know, people like talking to us, and we're doing a lot of stuff with Anstey, and our aim is to make it easy and straightforward. Thanks.
Simon, thank you very much, and apologies as well. We probably cut your slide deck a little bit shorter than you'd anticipated, but it does mean that people have the benefit of seeing a bit more of you, which is perfect. So thank you very much, and it is a fantastic story for GridServe, and I think, you know, key for me is clearly we've got the electric forecourts. They're absolutely stunning, you know, really sort of showing us the way forward. But in the meantime, I guess, you know, I think key is that there are other size options available, from the little bit smaller to the increasingly large. So I think we're just seeing if there are any questions in the Q&A, not as yet. So in the meantime, I suppose perhaps I could just drill down a little bit more on that, Simon. And if you were going to say, what might work, for example, if you had a, you know, a housing development of sort of 50, 60 units, you know, what sort of option might there be for a sort of destination, and how might the sort of the electric forecourt sort of shape itself around a you know, a new housing development, for example?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because we're talking to a number of housing developers up and down the country that are looking for support and ideas around developments anywhere from 50 to 5,000 houses. Some of the large urban extensions along the southern and A27 corridor, which obviously we're all aware of. And I guess what we do is we make it easy for people to stick to their core business, because as a developer of housing, you know, you don't really want to have to put a charger in at every location every time, for a couple of reasons. One is you can't charge any more for the house. The second is it probably makes your M&E fit out of the house a little more complicated. And there's the sort of elephant in the room, which is that people are going to start saying, well, you know, if you've got charging infrastructure, do you need three-phase power into a house? And that just makes your, you know, it turns your profitability of residential development on its head. Because if you have to put three-phase power in, it triggers all sorts of knock-on effects in terms of layout, design, size of walls, that kind of thing. So what we would do typically is say, right, well, where are you going to be located? How big are you there? And we can do everything from support a sort of an electric hub with a coffee, food, drink, drive-through. We're doing a lot of stuff with people like Costa, because they're a good partner of ours. We're a number of farm shop locations around the country. So, you know, we can bring in a small concession if one is not already there, or we can work with who is going to run the commercial center. And, you know, we can also be the commercial center, because if you pop an electric forecourt into the development, then you've got, you know, most of what you need if you were going to otherwise talk to sort of people like Tesco Express.
Yeah.
Now, the other point, I think, which is really important, is that from a development planning and development point of view, if we go in early on a development as part of a sort of master planning and strategic exercise, we sort of enable the zero carbon transport position straight out of the box. And we're looking at a number of schemes, both industrial as well as commercial, where the developers saying to us, look, you know, we're going through planning, but if you want to put in an application early to put in something off the bell mouth or the roundabout that's servicing the site, and there's probably a dozen of these discussions going on at the moment in the southeast, let alone across the whole country, a lot more at that scale. We can just pop up, build our model, build our electric forecourt at some scale, and then the planner can then point to this as a sort of enabling development, and then say, right, I'm going to put my houses, my sheds, my retail, my whatever, and it's a very complementary approach.
And this is it. I think that's exactly right. It's about sort of trying to make sure that any new development is properly, it's not islanded, it's properly integrated with the local existing infrastructure. And I think there's a great opportunity then to do something fun along the way. Simon, tell me this as well. The question I've sort of been meaning to ask is, Mark talked about mobility hubs and this sort of community placemaking, where we sort of create something that's multimodal and interesting. And presumably at some point, grid serves charging vehicles, but also might be able to spur off and charge some e-bikes, possibly sort of charge somebody's car club vehicle. Are those sort of things starting to filter their way to you?
They really are. They really are. I mean, all of the sites that we're developing at the moment, we're building in east side of Norwich, Gatwick, Uckfield, and Sussex. There's some other really interesting locations which are going to be announced as we go through the planning process. We link through to urban transport networks. We are very keen on supporting all transport, not just the private car. Braintree is configured to allow bus charging, medium and heavy goods charging. We have the e-bike concession there. We're working closely with likes of Enterprise Rent-A-Car on electric vehicle provision there. In some cases, such as Norwich, probably going to have a all-electric vehicle rental facility bang next to our electric forecourt. And they also want to sort of put car club vehicles at most of our sites. They're doing a lot of work with local authorities across the south in car club provision. So it all comes together. So we basically say, right, tell us what you want to do, and we'll enable the infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think if you're sort of building houses, building communities, I think that understanding that there is, we're not suggesting an instant switch away from the private motor car, but there are options emerging that may do several things. It may allow people to, save their own domestic costs. It may save the number of parking spaces you have to put into a development. It may, as I say, create some community. It may create some revenue that can be sort of circulated around. But it's good to hear the grid server kind of sitting at the heart of that and enable to, encourage multimodal transport and not just, battery-powered cars.
Yeah, because for us, it's all about making the experience and transition to electric transport, easy, straightforward, cost-effective, and enjoyable. So, we're happy to have conversations with people about, all sorts of things.
And there's a lovely sort of tone there as well about, I guess, getting on the front foot with your sort of planning process and your engagement with regulators and communities, and saying, actually, look, this isn't just something we have to do. This is something we can offer that really makes our development stand out, integrates with the local environment, the local transport infrastructure, and in doing so is also offering something really, really exciting, really attractive, and a good exemplar to sell some units at the end of the day.
Yeah, and in many locations we're building sort of solar that's co-located, and that for many housing developers also sort of sorts out the old nugget of how much does the grid cost to bring in the power. If you were just going to sort of SSE or WPD and say, right, I'm building some houses, I need 10 megawatts, please. They might surprise you with the number of zeros on that connection cost. But if we can come in and we can provide, effectively energy generation, storage, and solutions as part of what we are already doing,
and demand,
it makes it much more straightforward. And of course, it's sort of zero carbon generation. So it's a practical, technical, as well as a behavioral solution for people.
And I really like the way you've ended on the word behavioural there, and I think I'll sort of use this as my sort of wrapping up a thought. But what I really enjoy about this discussion and these discussions as an energy practitioner, it's been a lot about building things in fields or building things in industrial estates, and what we're now doing is talking about people, talking about the way people live and the way they behave, how long they might take to drink their coffee, what they might want to look at whilst they're waiting, and it's brought this sort of this infrastructure development right into the heart of individuals. And I think that's also at the very core of our developers and property developers and housing developers. It's about infrastructure but at a human level, and I think that has to be the way we shape this as we move forward.
Exactly.
Well, with that in mind, it is now midday. So thank you very much indeed to everybody that's attended. Thank you to Simon, particularly for giving us his thoughts, his wisdom. Really appreciate that. And to Becca, Christian, Mark, as well for their thoughts on the various subjects as we've gone through. Please do check out the recording. It will be made available on our website. Do let us know by email, by LinkedIn, by whatever medium you fancy if you've got any further questions or would like to sort of chat further. I'm sure our details will be available. And in the meantime, just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to hopefully talking to you more as we all go along this journey together. In the meantime, thanks very much, and do take care.